Buenos días. Mi español no bueno, so I'm going to speak in English. I apologize. But the slides will be in Espanol, and hopefully you have the translation. I'm very pleased to be here, and thank you very much for inviting me. It's a great honor to come and speak in Uruguay. And I've had the privilege of learning a little bit about what Uruguay is doing with regard to protected areas and adaptive management. And it's very exciting. I think Uruguay and the colleagues in Latin America who are working on the adaptive management group of REDLAC are helping lead the world in thinking about these ideas. So it's a very great honor to be able to speak here about this. So today, I'm going to talk about adaptive management and assessing protected area effectiveness. But I want to start with a story. So how many people in the room know that the first president of my country, the United States, George Washington, was murdered? Okay, a couple people know the story. For those of you who don't, here's the story of how he was murdered. And this comes from my colleague, Bill Sutherland. So in 1799, after he was president, he went back to his plantation, and he went out riding in the snow, and then he had a sore throat, and so he had some difficulty breathing, and so he went to his estate supervisor, who gave him some vinegar, and then they took out a pint of blood, half a liter of blood. There was his doctor coming, and he gargled him and put some beetles on his throat, and they took out another pint of blood, half a liter. He wasn't doing very well, so they took out another pint of blood. They gargled him with vinegar. He almost suffocated. They took out 2 more pints of blood, so another liter of blood. Then the real doctor came, the fancy doctor, and what do you think the fancy doctor did? He took out 2 more pints of blood, another liter of blood. And by the end of the day, George had a weak pulse, and he died. And over the day, they took out almost 3 liters, 4 liters of blood from him. Crazy, yeah? So it's not murder, but it's ignorance. And it wasn't until this guy came around a little bit later, and he used numerical methods to show that bloodletting is not an effective treatment in most cases. So we can laugh at these guys and these doctors, but I ask you, when you think about the effectiveness of the work we do as conservationists, do we really know what we're doing is working? Are we really any better right now than the doctors were? And can we get smarter about that? So I'm going to do 2 things in this presentation. I want to give you an introduction to the idea of adaptive management, and then I want to talk about some principles about how we use adaptive management to look at the effectiveness of protected areas. So I work along with my colleague Paula for Foundations of Success. We've been around about 20 years. We are based both in the United States, but we have then branches as part of the collective in Latin America, Europe, and now Africa. Paula here is the leader of the group who works in Latin America. Our mission is to improve the practice of conservation, but we don't actually implement projects ourselves. We try to make other people's projects and programs better. So we help people design, manage, monitor, and learn from their work. We're also part of something bigger called the Conservation Measures Partnership, or CMP. This has also been around about 20 years, and it's a collection of different organizations and agencies and funders who are all interested in improving how conservation works. Someday, it would be good to have maybe the ministry here and other groups join the Conservation Measures Partnership. So as you all know, conservation work takes place in very complex and dynamic systems. So the projects have to deal with a lot of unpredictable change, and they have to work in these complicated systems. And the project teams, the people implementing conservation work, don't have enough information. They have to work in the face of uncertainty. They have to report their performance to their funders and supporters, and they can improve and they can learn. So this idea of adaptive management, it's been around for a while. Some people think that adaptive management is the license or freedom to do whatever you want. I'm going to try something, and if it fails, I'll tell my boss that I'm managing adaptively. And that's not the case. It's not just the freedom to do whatever you want. It goes back to the 1970s and 1980s, where an academic named Buzz Holling, C.S. Holling, and a lot of his colleagues, they had this idea that in complicated systems, we can't just do command and control, but we have to actually treat our interventions, they called them policies, as experiments, develop a model to understand the system, and then see and learn what works and what doesn't work. And so adaptive management kind of combines both results, action, and research. So if you're a pure professional, all you really care about are results. And so if you think about the cliche, you are in preparar fuego. So ready, fire. You have to do. If you're a pure academic or a pure researcher, then all you care about is really knowledge or understanding, but you can think about them as ready. You're not really taking action. If you're an adaptive manager, you're in the middle. You care about both results, but you also want to learn and get smarter. And so you're going to ready, aim, fire, preparar, amputar, fuego, and then you're going to think about whether it worked or not and how you can get better. The trouble with the academics, Buzz Hollings and people, they had a really brilliant idea, but they didn't really know how to communicate it. It was kind of academic. So in their work for practitioners, and mind you, this is for practitioners, they put a lot of mathematical equations that look like that. And if you look below, it says the interpretation of equation 9 is both simple and important. So keep that in mind, it's simple. And then they had a lot of graphs that look like this. So I don't know, if you talk to your boss about that, it's hard to understand what that actually means. So going back about 20 years ago, the people in the Conservation Measures Partnership got together, and we looked at how many different fields, so business and management, education, international development, public health, environment, how they all worked in the face of uncertainty and made decisions. And I'll spare you all the details, but we learned that every one of those fields was going in the 70s from doing evaluations at the end of a project or program to more ongoing formative evaluations to full-on project cycle-based monitoring, doing your monitoring and your learning in the context of the work that you're doing. So that was very helpful to see what all these other groups did. At the time, 20 years ago, we also looked at the members of the Conservation Measures Partnership. So a bunch of NGOs like the Nature Conservancy or WWF. And the thing there is that we were all doing similar things, but we were confusing each other with language. So that what one group called a target, another group called a species, another group called a goal. Here people use targets to mean more like objectives. It gets even more complicated in Spanish, the difference between objetivos and metas. So there's a lot of confusion about language. And what we were able to do is take all those different concepts and create the open standards for the practice of conservation. So this was the first version in 2004, then in 2007, and then a third version, and now the fourth version in 2020. And these are the steps in the conservation standards. There's nothing radically new here. People have been talking about project management for a long time, but it's a set of principles and practices to think about how to do this work. And I'm going to go very quickly with a very simple example of what this looks like. So step 1 in the standards says, define the problem. What is it that you're trying, what is the scope of the problem that you're trying to manage? Are we measuring or trying to save one small village? Or are we trying to save an entire ocean? And both of those are okay, but you have to be clear. And so in this case, we're helping this community manage their marine waters. You also have to talk about who's on the team, who's involved in doing the thinking. And that includes both the core working group, but also key stakeholders or the community. So there are many people that we have to think about being involved in the work. And then we asked to come up with a model of the system. And so if you remember Buzz Holling, they talked about models. They used a lot of mathematical models. We prefer something a little simpler, which are pictures or diagrams of what is it that you care about. So maybe we care about turtles. Maybe those turtles are being threatened by subsistence harvesting. We also care about fish, but they're being commercially harvested, but they're also an important protein source for that village. So again, this is a model. It's getting everybody in the project on the same page about what the situation is. Step 2 is then, once you understand what those problems are, you talk about what are you going to do to change the situation. And so we're going to be strategic. But as my old boss used to say, a strategic plan is not a thick plan that says strategic plan. It's really understanding what are you going to do, but also what are you not going to do and why. It's about making strategic choices about how to spend your time and treasure. And so the conservation standards give you a bunch of tools to prioritize which targets you most care about, what are the threats that are most important, and what can you do, what are your options for changing that situation. As part of step 2, in particular, and this will be important later, we want to think about the theory behind how our actions lead to our intended outcomes. So in this case, the community decided that they had an overfishing problem, and they were going to use a traditional fish closure where they would say certain areas are not permitted to fish during certain parts of the year. So they're going back to the traditional system. So they're going to set up that traditional closure system, and their assumption is if they do that, then the fish will be able to reproduce in the closed zones. There'll be a higher proportion of clams and fish for people, seafood for people to harvest. They're going to then have growth, and then there'll be more for people to harvest. So this gives you kind of the theory of how the action leads to desired outcomes. And then based on that, we can come up with our assumptions, what are our questions, as well as what are our objectives and metas, and indicators that we can track. So this theory of change is really important to understand how our action, we think, will lead to its desired outcomes. Once we do that, then we actually have to implement the work and we have to implement the monitoring. So we're going to count the number of clams inside and outside the protected area. And then we're going to analyze the data. And in this case, the blue shows the numbers and sizes of clams they had before, and the orange shows the number and sizes of clams they had after. So in this case, their theory held. They had more clams and bigger ones. It worked. But in many cases, you might find it doesn't work. That's okay, but what you want to do is then not keep doing the same strategy. What you want to do is take that knowledge and use it to change or adapt your work over time. And then the last step is to share what you've learned with your team, but also with the rest of the world, so we can get smarter about what we do together. So I'm going to come back to this question of adaptive management. What is adaptive management? And I would say that the definition, the answer is going through the steps in this conservation standard cycle. Now, it doesn't have to be this exact cycle. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has its own version. The United States Agency for International Development has its own version. There's even a really cool version that started in Australia where they're working with indigenous land managers. They call it healthy country planning, and they're using with the Aboriginal groups, it's now spreading to Canada and elsewhere in the world, using it to manage their traditional indigenous territories. So you don't have to use the exact words of the conservation standards, but what adaptive management is going through this process and getting smarter, achieving results, but also learning and gaining knowledge as you go. So that's a little bit about adaptive management. Are we okay with the pace that people are able to understand? That's okay? All right. So everyone now knows, hopefully, what adaptive management is. So now let's talk a little bit about how we apply these ideas to protected area effectiveness. And again, a lot of this, people here in Uruguay, the Uruguay Park System, you're already doing a lot of this, but hopefully this will be capturing some of the work that you're doing and talk about it. Some of this work also comes from work that we're doing to develop a framework for assessing the effectiveness of protected areas for the World Commission on Protected Areas. As you can see here, my colleague Paula and I are the vice chairs for the group that is working on effective conservation. And so we're helping take ideas from here, from Uruguay and from Latin America, and bring them to the rest of the world. So as you all know, there's a lot of interest right now in the world about the effectiveness of protected areas. So this is the CBD Target 3 that was agreed on in Montreal. And I draw your attention to this words, the highlighted words here. We want to get to 30 by 30, but it's not just 30% of the world's surface, it's 30% are effectively conserved and managed. So what does that actually mean, and how do we actually track that? And that's where we think the WCPA has some role to play in helping think through how to think about that question of effectiveness. But to do that, we have to agree on what we mean by it. And so we've spent the last year or so trying to think about a framework to think about effectiveness in the context of protected areas. And when I say protected areas, I mean both protected areas as well as OECMs, so other conservation areas as well. So there are 8-ish principles that we came up with, and I'm going to go through each of these principles one by one. So the first principle is that we want to build on existing frameworks and tools that are already in use. So as you all know, there's a lot of tools out there. For 25 years, 30 years, there's been the Met Handbook. There's now the IUCN Green List of Protected and Conserved Areas, the standards. And then many countries have their own versions of these as well. And then there's the conservation standards. And there's 20 more of these or 30 more of these different tools and frameworks. So there's a lot of thinking and a lot of good ideas in those frameworks. And so our working group started by creating what we call a Rosetta Stone. You can't read this, but basically what it shows is each column here is one of those tools or frameworks. And we said, how are they thinking about assessing effectiveness? So you can see by putting them side by side, you can see where they're similar, where there are differences, and where there are gaps. So we are trying to build on the existing work. The second principle is that we think you can only really define and assess effectiveness across a theory of change. Do you remember the theory of change I showed you for that single conservation strategy? It's similar for protected areas as well. And so I want to give you a small quiz here that maybe makes a point. Let's imagine that there are 2 forested sites somewhere in the world. Site A has a bunch of trees. It has a community living in one corner of it, and they are farming here, and they hunt throughout the area. And Site B, no human being has ever set foot in it. It's completely pristine. Okay, I used to work in Papua New Guinea. It might be possible there, but even today that's probably not really true. But let's, for the sake of argument, imagine that's true. So Site B is completely intact, and Site A has the people farming and hunting. I'm going to ask you a question. Which site is better conserved? I want a show of hands. How many people think Site A is better conserved? You raise your hand. Okay. How many people think Site B is better conserved? Of course, right? Because it has all the animals, it has all the ecosystem functioning, it has everything intact. It must be better. I think, hey, you know it's a trick question. So here's one more piece of information. What if I told you 6 months from now, not today, but 6 months in the future, a logging company is going to come and clear cut site B? Okay? But we're still 6 months before. So if I ask you now, which site is better conserved, how many people would say site A? Okay. How about B? Still? Okay. What I hope this illustrates is that conservation is about biology. It is about the species and the ecosystems and the benefits that they deliver for people. But conservation is also about the absence of threat. It's about knowing where those threats are coming and making sure that they're not coming more of them. And it's also about the capacity of groups to take action, to be able to change the situation. And we need to think about conservation effectiveness in all those different areas of that theory of change. So that's really important. It's about outcomes, but it's not just the biology outcomes. It's about understanding that entire theory of change. So if you think about the green list criteria or the MET or some of these principles, there really is a theory of change there. If we're working in one protected area or protected and conserved area, we have to have good governance, we have to have a good design, and we have to have the right enabling conditions. Those will lead to good management. That will hopefully lead to threats being diminished, which will lead to good biodiversity and benefits for humans. And we also probably need some adaptive management to be improving that work over time. So this is one particular protected area. And what I hope to show is that, let's say you have the good governance, but you don't yet have the good design, then you're not effective. You really have to have that governance in place. You have to have the design. You have to have the conditions, the management. You have to stop the threats. Maybe, as you'll see later, maybe we're not even changing the biodiversity yet, but we're on track to do that. We're looking at the biodiversity over time and the benefits and the adaptive management. And what we would say is that in order to be effective, you really need to be making progress on all these different areas to think about that protected area being effective. And that's what the green list is trying to do. That's what the MET is trying to do. But they're missing some of these key factors. And so what we're trying to do in our framework is fill in those gaps and really think about effectiveness along the theory of change. Okay. The third principle is that we want to think about effectiveness both at the level of the individual protected area, but also across the network. And of course, you know what I mean by this. We have an area here, and it has a team, and it has a bunch of strategies or things that it's trying to accomplish. And these are the values that that protected area has been assigned. But you can also think about the network of protected areas, which is also trying to achieve certain values and has a team managing that overall network. So coming back to this graph here, if you understand thinking about effectiveness at the individual level, we also have to think about the system as a whole. So we need to have good governance, good design, the right conditions, and good management at that system level. That leads, and this is a really important link, this good management leads to the capacity and the conditions for each area in the network to be able to function and to go through its theory of change. Hopefully we'll have connectivity in the overall design of the system, and that leads to the outcomes that we're trying to accomplish here, the threats and the biodiversity values at the level of the network or the level of the system. That arrow there may be some work that you can do at the system level to also diminish threats or save biodiversity, but that's dotted. Most of the work is starting here, coming down here, coming here, and then coming up here. And that's a really important link. I should acknowledge, by the way, that a lot of this graph, this ideas, came again from the Red Lac group working on adaptive management, including in particular, there was a Peruvian model that was very early on that was very influential in creating this graph. So this shows how the thinking that's happening here is leading to the conservation work that's happening at a global level. So we also have global conditions that we need to have in place. So here's the important thing. If that individual protected area or all the areas in the network are not successful, then I don't think that's possible. I don't think you can say the system is being effective unless the individual areas are effective. So it starts by assessing effectiveness there, and then we use that to track how effectiveness is happening at the system level. So it's really important to think about that. That makes sense to people? Okay. Okay. Now we're going to get a little bit more technical. Effectiveness also requires setting credible and smart objectives or outcomes. And really, what it is you can think about you're setting a bar that you have to clear as a high jump in order to get to the desired status of your protected area. So the team is saying, in order to get to our desired status, there's a certain threshold condition or set of conditions that we have to reach. So the bar represents the threshold for a given outcome. Specifying the height of the bar is really the job of the protected area managers or the system managers during the planning process. How far do we need to get? And then it represents what they need to accomplish in order to get to their desired outcomes. So it really requires setting that bar. The trick here is that you as a team could cheat and set the bar too low so that it's very easy to jump over, but it doesn't get you to your outcomes. So the bar has to be credible, but it also can't, strangely enough, be too high as well. And a great example of this is climate change. I was working with a protected area in Canada, and those protected area managers understand that over the next 30 years, all the species of animals and plants on their island are going to go away, and they're going to be replaced by other animals and plants that are coming up from the south. So if they say that to be effective, we have to conserve the moose, they're not going to win. They are not going to be effective. So they have to set the bar a little bit lower and say, we are going to conserve a space in which different animals and plants can move over time. So it has to be a credible bar, not too high and not too low. So that's the whole climate change story. And this is why we talk about smart outcomes. It has to be results-oriented, high enough to matter, achievable, which is low enough to be feasible. So that's kind of the height, not too low, not too high. But it also has to be then specific, measurable, and time limited so that it can be assessed. So when we build smart outcomes, it's because we want to set the bar in the right place. Now, actually, it's not one bar, but if you think about a theory of change, it's a set of bars where you have to meet your enabling conditions, you have to reach your intermediate results, you have to then have threat reduction, and then you have to get to the status of the values that you care about. So which team has been effective? How many people think Team A? How many people think Team B? Oh, you know it's a trick question now. Okay, but let me give you one more piece of information, which is that Team A had a current that was just floating along, and they didn't have to paddle, and the current carried them over the finish line. They just sat there while the current carried them over the finish line. And Team B had a huge current against them, and they're working and working and working and working just to stay in place. And now I ask the question, which team has been more effective? It's actually not quite so simple. So you have to give these people credit. they did what they was asked of them. They got across the finish line, so it's hard to vote against them. You would say they're effective. This team, maybe their internal bar that they set was just to stay in place. And if they set the internal bar to stay in place, then we actually might want to think about them as being effective as well, because they really did what was asked of them. Conservation is very difficult. If maybe you're not going to completely recover the jaguar population, but if you can at least stop the threats and keep it from going down, or maybe not down at such a fast rate, you can still be effective. So it's really important to argue about what the appropriate bar is that you're setting for your effectiveness measures. This is really hard. So then the question becomes, who does the assessment and how? In the software industry, and I'm sorry this is in English on the slide, but in the software industry, there's something called the iron triangle. And it says that if I want to commission a piece of software from a developer, it can be good, fast, or cheap. And you only get two of them. You can't have all three. You can be good and fast, but then it's going to be expensive. You can be cheap and fast, but then it's not going to be good. And you can be good and cheap, but it won't be fast. You only get two of those three. Okay? So when we talk about evaluations and who does the evaluation, I think there's something similar here. Let's talk about an evaluation or an assessment that is useful for management. We also want to think about an evaluation that is feasible, that you can actually do across an entire system of protected areas. And we want to think about a system that is credible, that people believe the answers. Okay? There's this concept in evaluation of who does the evaluation: first party, second party, third party. First party is when I say my work is good, or we say our work is good. Second party is when our colleagues say the work is good. And third party is when an independent group comes and assesses our work. So I would say that a third party theory of change-based assessment is going to be useful and credible, but not necessarily feasible. To get the eagles or to get somebody to rate every protected area is going to be very difficult. A non-theory of change-based evaluation is feasible and maybe credible, like the MET, where it's more of a scorecard, but I'm not sure it's very useful. If you have a first-party evaluation, it's feasible and useful. The team can do it to their stuff, but maybe people won't believe the team. It's not clear that it's going to be credible. And the question is impossible in the middle? Or could we do some second party where people are peer reviewing and looking at each other is something I think we have to explore. So we're going to have to look at how to think about doing those evaluations. Our sixth principle is that it has to be integrated into existing systems and businesses. One thing I'm very pleased to report is that our task force is now working with the Protected Planet database, which is the scorecard keeper for much of the Target 3 work. And they are hoping to incorporate this framework and thinking in their work. So we want to build it into existing systems. And part of this is where people have done the MET or green list. We can use those rankings and feed them into whatever assessment we do, maybe adding a little bit more to make sure we're complete. Okay. The seventh, and this is a very important principle, is that we want to use assessment. It works better in English, so I'm sorry for this, but is used for improving rather than for proving. So we want to use it to make our work better. And so our theory of change is that if all protected areas and OECMs have public, credible, current, and useful outcome-based assessments, then protected area managers can use the assessments to improve their practices. They can get the resources that they actually need to do this work. And that will lead to better outcomes in both the protected area and the systems. There's also a chain here that says if we can show that 30 by 30 commitments are being tracked, then the public and society will have confidence that we're achieving what we set out to do, and then they will provide the resources necessary to do this work. But what this means is we're not trying to do assessments or evaluation to say, bad, that's a failure. Failure's okay. We want to use this to improve, but people have to understand that it's really important to use this stuff to get better and to see where the problems are so we can fix them. And that's why we want to do this. And so we ask people to do something in the conservation standards called pause and reflect, where we actually ask people 4 questions every 6 months or every year in relation to their strategic plan. Did we do what we said we would do? So did you implement your actions? Did our actions achieve our desired results? So are we seeing the change in the system that we want to see? How do we need to change our strategy to fix any problems? And what have we learned? What do we still need to know? So one last quiz. If we're in a situation like this, where the green shows you we've achieved our activities, so we did what we set out to do, and the green here shows we're seeing the results, how would you rate this theory of change for this action? Success, right? This is the case where you did your work, you saw the results, good things happened. Right, what about this case? Here, we didn't implement our actions, and the results have not yet happened. If you are a manager, what's your conclusion here? This is a failure of implementation. Somehow, we didn't do the right actions, and we have to then take action. Maybe they didn't have enough staff or resources. Maybe some other problem emerged that we have to help the team fix. But it's understanding what do they need to do to get that work done, and that's how we're going to use them. The third case is, in this case, we did the actions, but we didn't see the results that we expected to see. The system didn't change in the right way. What do you conclude from that? In this case, this is a theory failure. Somehow we had the wrong design. Maybe there's a new threat. Maybe the world's changed. Maybe we had a bad design. We're going to have to go back and fix that design and make that design better. The last case is when you didn't do your actions, and yet you still got the results that you hoped to see. How do you explain that? This is that first team in the boat. This is the team that has the current, where their current is maybe pushing them along, and they don't have to do a lot of work. And so that's the case where maybe they got lucky, or maybe it was also potentially a failure of monitoring. Maybe we're not detecting the right things. But I hope you can see that the whole key here is to use your learning and thinking and evaluation in order to make things better. Okay, my last principle is to recognize that monitoring and assessment is expensive, and we don't want to do as much of it as we can. We want to do the least amount that we need in order to be effective. And I'm going to give you an example of a gauge in a car. So say you're driving your car, and you have a gas tank here, and this gauge is showing you information you need to make a management decision. So the question is, when do we need to get more gas or petrol for our car? There's a measure. So the car company builds a little float that measures how much liquid is in your tank. But the measure by itself is actually not that helpful. What makes the measure useful is the markings that show full, half, and empty, and it's the little light that goes off when you only have 2 liters left and you have to pull over and get gas. And so what car companies have started to do now is give you exactly the information you need to know 170 miles or kilometers you have left before you have to get the tank filled. Here's the thing though. If this said 170 or about 170, or it said 169.8325621, would you make a different decision? No. Okay? So it doesn't have to be that precise. It just has to be accurate. You have to know that it's about this, it means about that. And so you don't have to invest that much money in being precise. You just need enough to make the decision. And in the car world, you can look at another instrument called a tachometer, and it measures how fast your engine is spinning. And if you're driving a manual, you, I suppose, could use it to when to shift or you're going to burn out your engine. So car companies go to great expense to build a detector, and then they put this gauge on the dial, on the dashboard, and it takes away people's attention. But as I showed you here, in most cars that are either automatic or if you drive a stick, you do it by your ear, it's actually a useless gauge. You're not going to do anything with it. And so what we don't want to do is build gauges that aren't going to help us make better management decisions. We want to focus our monitoring where it's useful. And so as one example of this, you can look here at our investment in evidence acquisition and analysis. And this is the probability of making the correct decision. And if you don't invest anything in adaptive management or thinking, you might get lucky, you might make the right decision, but it's a low probability. If you invest just a little bit of thinking and do a theory of change and some of the basic conservation standards, you'll get up to point B. And then if you invest a lot more science and research and do things to the gold standard, you'll get to C. Eventually you might start to confuse things, and then you get to planning paralysis and you don't make any decision. And so what we think is that the gold standard, the double-blind controlled studies, the fancy monitoring, that might be useful in a few cases where it really matters, where there's a high stakes, where there's a high burden of proof. But in most cases, we're probably much better off somewhere here doing a little bit of investing in evidence and thinking, enough to increase our probability of making the right decision. So those are the 8 principles about how to think about effectiveness. I want to conclude with our fundamental hypothesis. So right now, you can look at 100% of the investment that society makes in protected areas or conservation projects of all kinds, including protected areas. Some fraction of that is leading to positive success, and some fraction of that is leading to failure. Now, I can't tell you where we are today, but I know it's not 100%, that a lot of those resources are not being effective. And so what we want to do here is we want to think about using a little bit of resources for adaptive management. So we are taking some time and treasure and getting adaptive management going here. But the idea is that if we take that investment in thinking and being smart, we can make the overall green area bigger, even if we're taking that investment there. And if we can convince society that we're actually spending the money wisely, then maybe we can even grow the pie. Let me show you what I mean by growing the pie. We in conservation are working against other causes. Governments have other things that they're worried about. So education of school children or curing disease or whatever it might be. And those are all important concerns. But if they can show they're effective and we can't, our pie, our resources is going to shrink. Whereas if we can show we're effective, maybe we can grow our pie and get the resources that we need to do our important work of conservation. And so in conclusion, we think that using adaptive management will lead to more effective protected areas. And I think we're seeing this here in Uruguay, hopefully. So that we get to a place where we can rate how those protected areas are doing, and maybe initially one is doing well, a couple not so much, we have questions there. But if we keep working at it and think about it, overall we're not effective to start, but we can start to make those things more effective over time and then lead to an effective network. And I think that's the goal of what we're trying to do here with adaptive management. So with that, you can get more information, and I would be happy to take any questions.
Vamos a dedicar muchas gracias, Nick. Vamos a dedicar unos minutos para alguna pregunta del público.
Hi, welcome. Thank you for the presentation. I would like to know your opinion about the 30-30 barrier that we signed today. Do you think it is a smart or is not a smart objective?
So the question is the 30 by 30 goal or outcome a smart objective? I think that it comes back to how we define effectiveness. So, and I think it requires a lot of the issues that we raised in this presentation. So you're going to have setting the bar. There's a question of who sets the bar. There's the question of how you measure it. I like the 30 by 30 target in the sense that it's ambitious, and I think it puts society looking forward and not just fighting backwards looking battles. But it's going to be very challenging to actually achieve that in a smart way. And I think we're going to have to build on all the good work that's happening in Uruguay and beyond in order to reach that target.
Buenos días, Nick. Muy buena presentación, felicitaciones. Yo quería preguntarte en torno a lo importante de la implementación del manejo adaptativo para la efectividad es el aprendizaje. Creo que has hecho mucho énfasis en eso, ¿no? Entonces, ¿cómo poder tener en cuenta en una medición de efectividad ese aprendizaje? Porque pusiste un ejemplo bastante importante, ¿no? Hay gente que no llega a la meta porque de repente en su teoría de cambio la estrategia no fue la adecuada, pero finalmente implementó manejo adaptativo porque cambió una estrategia y está en ese camino. O de repente las condiciones de contexto no le permitieron llegar a la meta, pero cumplió con sus tareas, pero no logró el resultado. ¿Cómo le damos un valor también a eso para decir que un área está siendo efectiva, ¿no? Porque claro, fríamente si no lograste el resultado no está siendo efectivo, pero si estás haciendo el ciclo de manejo adaptativo, estás aprendiendo y eso lo estás mostrando, creo que ahí necesitamos al momento de diseñar una herramienta de efectividad, tener en cuenta eso, no sé si en puntaje o de qué manera, o cualitativamente, pero tenerlo en cuenta. ¿Cómo piensas que podríamos trabajar ese aspecto?
Okay, so that's a very good question. Let's go back to this example here. And I think the critical thing here is all about what's the bar and who sets the bar. And so, in this case, these people did achieve success. Now, maybe they didn't earn it. Maybe they didn't have to work very hard. But it's hard to complain. I mean, if they got to where they got, you have the hand you're dealt. You have to work with what you have. And it's hard to say, you know, I would say that they generally, it's okay to sort of have them get success even if they got lucky. It's this team that's very interesting, right? Because in this case, they didn't necessarily save the Jaguar yet. But again, if the Jaguar was, when they started, very low and there were a lot of threats, and they at least stopped the threats, but it might take 20 more years for the Jaguar population to rebound to where you want to be, I think a reasonable person would say, this team is still being effective. because they set their intermediate bar as stopping those threats. So I think this is why a theory of change is so important. And what we have to do is agree that that team has set an appropriate, credible, short-term bar. They're on the road to effectiveness, even though they're going against that really big current. The challenge is that's a complicated story. And when you want to report to the minister who wants one number or one up or down vote, that can be really challenging to do. I think we're going to have to work together to figure out how to collect and then tell that story in a way that people can score it. But I think the work that's going on here gives us the examples and the tools to have that conversation. Edgar, does that make sense?
¿Alguna otra pregunta?
In Spanish, could be. ¿Qué tal? Yo quería que nos des una reflexión sobre incentivos para hacer la evaluación de los proyectos o de las áreas protegidas. Tenemos una cultura que tiene el ejercicio de evaluación como una gran amenaza, como un peligro, porque si algo salió mal, nuestros jefes nos van a castigar, entonces mejor no lo decimos o lo ocultamos. ¿Cómo podemos incentivar que se haga una evaluación sincera que nos permita aprender?
So that is a very good question, and I think there's a lot of truth and reality there. One of the analogies that I sometimes use, I call it from the fairy tale, the Snow White hypothesis. And what the Snow White hypothesis says is that with the conservation standards or with effectiveness measures, we force teams and their bosses to look in the mirror at their project. And when they look, they often see that their project is kind of ugly and maybe needs some help or is not working so well. And generally the bosses, their next response is, this mirror sucks, and they throw the mirror away. They don't want to look. They don't want to do the evaluation. So that's what you're talking about, that the people don't want to see the problem. At the end of the day, though, I think most people in this room are here. Yeah, it's your job. Yeah, it's a paycheck. It supports your family. I get that. It's important to keep your job. But we all could be doing other things as well. And I think we're here because we care about conservation and we care about the environment. And if you really care, then you have to try to get better. You have to try to figure out how to make it work. And I think that what our job is to do is to convince society and convince the bosses that this is hard, but that we are being effective. But then we also have to be realizing there are teams that are maybe not being effective, and then how do we help them get better over time? So I think we have to collectively tell the story and make the argument that this is really the only way. And I'm going to go back to George Washington and his doctors. Today, we all look back at those doctors and say, they were such idiots. But that was the best science at the time. And I don't know about you, but I don't want to be thinking about my grandchildren looking back at how we made decisions today and thinking we were equally dumb. And so I think we have to step up and do it so that we actually get smarter about what we do.
Tenemos unos minutos para una consulta más, si alguien desea del público. Si no, vamos a dar paso a lo que es las reflexiones de lo que ha sido el Congreso de parte de Lucía Bartesagui. ¿Alguna otra consulta que quieran hacer? Por allá.
Hi Nick, good morning. Thank you very much for your presentation. It was really good. I want to know about your opinion about how feasible do you see applying this kind of criteria in Uruguay, considering that more than 90% of our land is in private properties?
So That's an interesting question. And I'm going to reflect a little on my own career here. So when I started off working in conservation 40, 50 years ago, a lot of this was about, we have to look beyond protected areas. So we have to think about the matrix. We have to think about community-based conservation, because protected areas aren't going to be big enough to save everything that we need. And so I've spent a long time thinking about how to help people do conservation outside of protected areas and working with indigenous land managers or working with other conservationists. But I find it really interesting now to come back to protected areas. And I think that, as always, the answer is both. We need the protected areas. We need to make them more effective and better. But we also then need to think about how to work with the wider society, to work with farmers to improve practices or at least reduce the harm. And so I think we need to think about still both of those areas and bring them together. But it comes back to then thinking about what are the outcomes and objectives, not just at a protected area scale, but at a landscape or seascape scale, and what is it going to take to get there?
Vamos a tomarnos unos minutitos más para ahora sí la última pregunta. ¿Alguien?
Bueno, buenos días, muchas gracias por tu presentación, muy interesante, y tener la oportunidad también saber cuáles son las discusiones que se están dando desde la comisión. Tú mencionaste que en el marco de la efectividad del manejo que se viene desarrollando, se ha hecho un análisis de Rosetta para comparar las diferentes metodologías de efectividad del manejo. Dentro de ese análisis, ustedes han comparado lo que es el estándar lista verde con otras metodologías como MET que existen a nivel mundial. Quisiera saber qué resultados encontraron ustedes a partir de ese análisis comparativo que hicieron entre cada una de las metodologías, y también qué oportunidades han encontrado para retroalimentar el estándar lista verde. El estándar lista verde en este momento está en proceso de actualización después de que salió el último manual del usuario, que fue en 2016, y junto con los documentos base del programa entra en un proceso de ajuste. Entonces me parecería muy interesante mencionar cuáles son los resultados que se encontraron de este análisis y qué oportunidades se ven frente al estándar lista verde, teniendo en cuenta esa actualización que se viene adelantando, y adicionalmente el desarrollo de una métrica de medición que está proponiendo UICN, que es el IBEX, para empezar a medir a nivel mundial y contribuir dentro de la meta 3.
So, very good question. We could spend an hour or 3 hours or 5 hours looking at the details of the Rosetta Stone analysis. I invite you to contact myself or Paola, and we can certainly share with you the detailed Rosetta Stone, and we would love to get comments. So please look for that. One of the things that we're doing through this is we're finding some kinds of gaps. So for example, one easy one is if you look at the green list, one of their principal components is good governance. If you look at the MET, which was written 20 years ago, doesn't have much to say about governance. It's a gap. And so if you really wanted to use the MET, you would want to add the MET, which is looking more at the effective management, alongside maybe add some governance questions to the MET to actually then make those assessments in a practical way. So I would encourage you to, again, check with Paolo and myself. We can show you the details, and it would be great to get feedback and input.
Muchísimas gracias.